Welcome to the inaugural issue of the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast, all about constructing your career in neurology. I'm your host, Sara Schaefer from the Yale School of Medicine. We're going to be covering a large swath of topics in this podcast, including types of careers and practices, not subspecialties, but rather academics, non-academics, private practice, locums, industry, concierge neurology, and more. We will talk with physicians who have switched and delve into their varied experiences, get into the real nuts and bolts of being a full-fledged physician in this field, CME, maintenance of certification, billing and coding, dealing with insurance companies, professional promotion and CV building, visas, consulting, work-life balance, and more. I hope you will learn a lot from what we have to offer, and I plan on learning a lot myself. So without further ado, today as part of the Contracts and Worth series, we welcome a triad of people from different backgrounds to talk about contract negotiation in academic neurology. This will be split into two parts. Part one will focus on the components of a contract, the terminology, and things to keep in mind, and part two will focus on the negotiation part of things. We have Louise McCullough, Professor and Chair of Neurology at the University of Texas, Houston, and Chief of Neurology at Memorial Hermann Hospital. Lauren Sansing, Associate Professor of Neurology at Yale, and Karen Davila, Board-Certified Healthcare Attorney at the Florida Healthcare Law Firm. Thank you to each of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules.
Thanks, Sarah. It's great to be here.
That this podcast is meant to be an overview and not a substitute for legal advice. You should defer to your own legal team for formal counsel. Louise, as chair, can you briefly discuss who all the stakeholders are in hiring a new faculty member? What is the process for approval of a position and of a specific person?
Well, that's a great question, and it's good that you're starting at the beginning. So as chair, we decide about what faculty we need, and the process is quite different depending on the type of faculty we're recruiting. So, of course, stakeholders usually involve the hospital, the medical school, and the dean. So if you're going for a clinical hire, is that clinical educator track, or is it a pure clinical track, or is it a research track? And those processes are quite different. All of them here at the University of Texas start with what we call an RTR, or request to recruit, which is really like a pro forma of who the person is, what sort of resources they will need, what their salary will be, are they bringing grants, and then if it's a clinical hire, how much of their time is expected to be clinical? Is it 50% with 50% other things, or is it more of a clinical track person? And that does matter because the compensation is different in a pure clinical track like a staff physician versus an assistant professor. So you have to get the approval from the dean, and if the position is for something like a stroke person or an inpatient person, we also try and get support from the hospital, as most of their work is done in the hospital. Now, if it's a research hire, a PhD, then that usually goes through the same RTR process, but it's usually with the dean of research, and you have to kind of allocate funds for startup, including if you have, for example, I have chair funds to recruit people. And then Texas also has some unique opportunities to recruit translational and researchers called STARS programs, where they'll give up to $2 million for a successful, well-funded recruit. And that can really be very, very helpful for recruitment. But the main stakeholders are the dean, the research dean, the chair, and the hospital administration.
That's a great overview. Thank you. Now let's get into the weeds a little bit of contracts. Karen, as a healthcare attorney, I'm sure you've seen many types of contracts from all kinds of different academic medical centers. Before we started recording, you said that you do contracts all over the country. What are the fundamental components of a typical academic medicine contract?
Thank you again for having me join this podcast. I do speak quite a bit on this topic, and every contract has some basic components that are going to be the same. But unique to this is understanding very well the scope of the work to be performed. And so to what Louise mentioned earlier, the allocation of effort between the clinical role, the administrative or academic teaching role, or scholarship, which is generally, research and writing, or other components of the work. It's important to understand that as one of the components of any contract that you are considering. In addition, understanding whether within that scope you have obligations for call coverage, what your schedule looks like, and so forth. And then also as to scope, it's important to understand that in an academic setting, you might have multiple locations to cover. And so you have to be clear and understand that before you're entering into any agreement. A big component of a contract is going to be understanding what the term is and the termination rights of the individuals. I recently reviewed an academic contract and noted that the notice period is much longer in some of these than you might expect in private practice. And so in this case, it was 6 months. It's not necessarily tied to an academic semester or period at all. And so I thought that was interesting. In terms of termination, the concern is who has the right to terminate and for what. I think there's greater protection in the academic setting for termination by the institution, by the university for cause. It's going to be driven heavily by policy and procedure, and absent doing something terribly wrong, termination for cause is unlikely. Rather, you should look at whether the university is going to give notice at the end of the term for renewal and how soon before, because planning your next move is important. In addition, obviously, compensation is important in understanding compensation. I know that there probably are some folks out there that aren't clear on how compensation is built, but essentially in an academic setting, you're going to have a base compensation, and then you which is for the appointment and for the basic services. But then you could also have an add-on component for teaching a particular course or leading a particular program. To the extent there is a clinical component, you might have a productivity bonus as well based on RVUs, billable RVUs. And then lastly, there is often a quality component. And so performance metrics are developed early on in the arrangement. Typically, I have not seen them provided prior to signing an offer letter. So it's important to have a good sense of what it might look like. And then another component that you will find in agreements that is often difficult for the new person to understand is what's called restrictive covenants. So I'll make it simple. These are things that prevent you from doing what you might otherwise be able to do if the agreement didn't prevent it. And they're legal obligations, which means if you breach these or you don't follow these restrictions, you could end up, if it's a breach or breaking those rules while you're in the clinical appointment, you could lose that appointment. If it is afterwards, it's the intent is to protect the intellectual property and assets of the university. And so if you're out trying to take things, including patient lists and other important information that belongs to the university, or any research you were working on that belongs to the university, these restrictive covenants will not only prevent you from doing that, but will entitle the university to take legal action against you if you violate them. So understanding the restrictive covenants of an agreement are very important. In terms of compensation, I want to go back to that because I think it's important to understand that compensation, as I mentioned, might have multiple components. As I said, clinical, you might have an education or administrative component, and then some scholarship. But in addition to that, for financial extras, you might consider whether the university is going to pay your moving expenses, whether they will set up some funding for any of your particular priorities that you can then use just on a discretionary basis to achieve some of your personal goals on behalf of the university. Sign-on bonuses are not uncommon in the private practice, but I've not seen a sign-on bonus recently at a university or academic environment. Non-financial extras you need to be thinking about are where are they going to give you an office, because the location of the office can cause you to spend more time than is necessary getting to and from if you have an office that is not in close proximity to where the majority of your work is done, and whether the university will offer a scribe for any of your work as needed. So those are all things to be thinking about. The last thing I want to mention here is about malpractice insurance. Depending on where you are, what university you're at, it might have sovereign immunity, which means it's protected to a certain extent from any malpractice suits. And I say to a certain extent. In Florida, the state has accepted on behalf of all of its agencies, including public teaching hospitals, a certain amount of responsibility to pay, but they cap it. And so depending on what your state law is, malpractice insurance could be very important for you. And then understanding whether once you leave the university, whether the university is responsible for covering claims that arise after you have terminated your employment with the university, but that arose while you were working for the university. So that's kind of a few things you need to be thinking about. And, we can talk later more about that if there's time.
So you went through some of the terminology that I've seen come up in speaking about contracts. That last piece where the malpractice insurance coverage extends to things that come up after you've left, that's called tail coverage. Is that correct?
Yes, it can be tail coverage if it's purchased by the entity that you left. It's typically tail coverage, or if you buy it, it might be tail coverage. If you are going to a new employer, you can negotiate for the new employer to pay what's called nose coverage, which means on the front end, they're buying out that liability, and or providing what's called a mature policy with a retroactive date. And it gets very complicated, but the retroactive date simply means that they will give you coverage back to the date of any exposure from the previous employment.
Great. Wow. You covered a lot there. You did mention percent effort, and Lauren, I wanted to pose this question to you. You may have been more in the know early in your career than I was, but I do remember that as a graduating fellow and as a resident, I started hearing about FTE and percent effort and protected time, and I had no idea what these things meant. What do these terms mean? How are they related to each other? And what are the things that can count towards FTE and the potential sources of funding?
Yeah, those are really great questions, Sarah, and really important for anyone who's looking at positions to understand, because it really comes down to what the expectations are for the department or organization that's hiring you, and to be able to make sure that those expectations align with what you want to do and what you're able to do in your new position. So your FTE is your full-time equivalent. So that's like the whole of your position, and it is likely going to be made up of different pieces of job responsibilities. So some of that will be your clinical portion, and so sometimes that's referred to as your CFTE or your clinical FTE, or your percent effort that's dedicated to clinical duties. And then, of course, within that realm, it may be a balance of inpatient and outpatient or call and that sort of thing. The non-clinical is often referred to as your protected time. And that means it's time that you're not expected to bring in clinical revenue in most cases to cover that. And that may be a sort of a mixture as well of research time, academic time for educational and teaching responsibilities, or administrative time if you have an administrative role or other function for the department or organization. So that sort of is the broad strokes. And then where does that money come from is a much deeper question.
Yeah, following the money. Usually a bit more complicated.
Yeah, so most of the time, places are set up where they understand what the billing expectations are for each position. And so the clinical time is usually set up so that you can make your clinical revenue to cover your clinical salary, or it will be sort of backstopped by some other piece, like the hospital or something like that. The other research time and educational time usually has to come from either medical school support, particularly if it's educational time or academic time, or part of a startup package if you're just starting out, to give you research time to develop your research program and compete effectively for grants. But then as you move on, that research time is most of the time expected to come from your external funding, meaning grants from either NIH or NSF or other nonprofit organizations like the Heart Association or the NCI, cancer institutes.
Yeah, we are going to get into that in more detail in the negotiation part in terms of negotiating as a clinical researcher or as a PhD. On a related topic regarding the clinical component of your FTE, or the CFTE, as I suppose it's called, thank you, Lauren, it's important to understand how your clinical productivity will be determined. This can affect things like bonuses, raises, clinical responsibilities, and promotion. Is that right, Louise? Can you tell us the different types of compensation plans that applicants may encounter, how they work, and maybe the advantages and disadvantages of each? I've heard of RVU-based versus session equivalents. What does that actually mean?
Okay, it's a great question, and it's a really important one to look at when you're looking at your contracts, and every place does it a little bit differently. The two major models that you just mentioned, RVU-based and session equivalents, is a way to figure out what part of your FTE is clinical. So, for example, if you're doing 3 days a week in clinic, that is 60% effort, 60% clinical effort. Now, those sessions are usually a 4-hour session from 8 to 12 or 1 to 5. Now, and each one of those would be 10% of your effort. Now, I don't particularly like the session equivalent model because there's so many factors that can go into that. If you have somebody who's very good at keeping your clinic full and things like that, but sometimes the session really has to be kept really strict. Like, so it's 8 to 12. It can't be 8:30 to 12. It can't be, your last patient's at 4. So sometimes I think it's difficult for providers to understand that that's not as flexible. They can't say, I'm going to start at 8:30 and end at 12:30. We try and do that, but that can be very difficult for the clinic staff to manage. And then also, if you have a lot of no-shows, certain specialties have more no-shows, then you're not generating any revenue, even though you're in clinic. So many places use an RVU-based system. Academics have kind of moved into this model. It's a very standard model for a more private practice or a staff physician. So now many academic centers like our own have a branch of community neurology, which is really more like a private practice model. Those people who are full-time clinicians are expected to do either full-time clinical work, which is 5 days a week in clinic, or if they're efficient, they can do 4.5 days and meet their RVU targets. So the RVU targets are based usually on MGMA and other ranking models, so you can figure out exactly what the target is. It is higher in private practice than it is in academics, simply because that's, you're a clinical track person. And some of the patients may be a little bit less complex than at an academic center. So in a standard RVU, you get usually 1 to 3 years, depending on the place, you get a guaranteed base salary. Some places don't start you on these RVU compensation plans for a year or two. You want to make sure that you work out, but that also protects the clinician because it may take time to build your practice. So you get a base salary that's usually around MGMA 50th percentile, depending where you are. If it's a very competitive or expensive city, they usually will go above that. And then after usually 2 years, you're shifted to an RVU-based plan, meaning you have a much, much lower base and you're comped by the amount of work that you do. So if you generate over your RVU target, you either get an incentive or $1 per RVU or some sort of model like that. Now, the disadvantage of that is if you are in academics and you want to do other things, it's very difficult to make those RVU targets, even if you account for percent of a clinical FTE, so 40%, it still can be quite difficult, to make RVU targets. The other thing about the RVU plan that I don't like is many places have a very low base. So I think it disadvantages certain people, especially like young women, for example, coming out of training. If you're on an RVU plan and you go out on maternity, then what do you do for the next 3 months? You have very poor comp. So, there's some security, and usually I discuss this with each faculty member, what type of plan they want to be on. Do they want to be on a 50th percentile base, and that's it, with occasional incentives for really high productivity with security, or do they want to work really, really hard and earn lots and lots of money? And that's an individual choice. I do think there are some risks to both plans. And then getting back to, who subsidizes the teaching and the administration. And that's where it's very difficult to make ends meet as a department chair, and why I spend, months doing budgets, trying to figure out where does this money come from, especially at a school like the University of Texas, which is one of the least expensive medical schools in the entire country. They're paying tuitions of $20,000. There's not a lot of money for education. And we end up doing a lot of that on the department's time, which of course is expensive. And then the other type of models you can get is if you're more research, you can also get research-based incentives, which I have a research-based incentive based on your percent funding for PhDs and more MD PhDs. And the other thing you have to take into account, my last point will be about compensation models. It also can be very difficult for a chair when you have a clinician who's earning a clinician salary as an associate professor of $250,000. The salary cap for NIH funding is around $200,000. So there's a $50,000 gap right there. So if that person is doing 50% of their time on a grant, you now have to do a thing called cost share, which is where the department has to pick up that amount that's over the cap for that 50th percentile. And that can also add up pretty quickly.
Well, it sounds like a great deal of being a chair is being an accountant.
Yes. No, the best part of being a chair is being able to mentor and talk to these faculty. And I tend to be very transparent with the faculty. I say, okay, which plan do you want to be on? If you're going to be on the clinical straight plan, then, you're going to get paid $250 coming out of fellowship. But you're going to have these high RVUs, and the expectation is that you're in clinic all the time. And if that's what they want, then I'll give them a base with an RVU. Some of them are like, no, I'd much rather just have a lower, more academic base and have a little bit more flexibility and autonomy.
Karen, a follow-up question to what Louise just told us. I wonder if you could shed some light on whether you've seen RVU-based models that allow for kind of a prorated reduction of RVU goals in the setting of things like maternity leave or other leaves of absence, or if generally those count against you in terms of your RVU targets.
So that's a very interesting question. I have not seen any contracts that have adequately addressed that. And so where there is not a solid base, a high enough base to support, the RVU model is not going to help in those contexts, and it is held against you in general. Now, all of this, by the way, is negotiable, number one, and all of it can be adjusted real time as you get to a point in the contract where you are facing those circumstances. Oftentimes, the parties are able to negotiate some type of arrangement that will accommodate, but it really is heavily dependent on that.
Okay. Well, FYI to our listeners, we will be doing a separate podcast on building your promotional packet in academics. But for now, let me ask Louise and Lauren, do you feel it's important to determine how you will be evaluated for promotion during the application process? Many academic centers have academic scorecards in which faculty fill out their scholarly work and teaching and other contributions each year in order for the chair's office to determine bonuses and other things. Do you think applicants should ask to see that scorecard prior to consideration of a position, or at least get a sense of what's included?
I think it's important to know what the standards for promotions are, and they tend to be very transparent, especially if you're, talking academics. Many of these things can be found on the website for the university or under faculty affairs, and they are pretty standard. It's based, scholarly work, teaching, education, administrative efforts, everything can be promotional. It just depends on whether you're going for tenure, because of course tenure is much more difficult and kind of comes with the expectation that you'll be having sustained extramural funding. I find with my clinical faculty, even though they may not be producing a lot of manuscripts, they do very important things, and it's very important that you highlight those as a chair. Building a new practice site, building up a deep brain stimulation program, doing more formal education. All of those should count towards promotion. So I think it's wise to ask, well, how does promotion work here? Get a little bit of a feel for it, but they are all pretty standard. I do think that talking with whoever your employer is going to be to see, do they value what you do? So if you're an educator, do they seem to value education? If you're a administrator, how do you get promoted by developing a new outpatient clinic or a new infusion center? Would that be considered part of the promotional effort? And I would say yes, but I do think it depends a little bit on your employer.
Yeah, we haven't really talked about academic tracks. Many institutions have set defined tracks when they do faculty hires. And I think understanding which track you're expected to be on and what the expectations for promotion on that track are is really important when you're looking at a job. And that just becomes part of what I brought up earlier, which is aligning the priorities and making sure that what you're looking for in a job is what they're looking for in the position. And those tracks can be anywhere from the clinical track, clinical educator, research, clinician scientist. They have different names at different institutions, but you should understand which track they're hiring for and what the expectations therefore are. And then making sure, and as Louise said, the sort of expectations for promotion for each of those tracks is usually pretty transparent on the faculty affairs websites. And then that could be a little bit different from scorecards that go into bonus structures. So there may be bonuses for going above and beyond, whether it's clinical productivity or academic productivity. But, having a broad understanding of what are you expected to do, how are you going to be measured, and how are you going to be able to sort of quantify your success in a position is really important.
Great. Thanks, everyone. This concludes part 1 on academic contracts. I certainly learned a lot in the last few minutes here. Don't miss part 2, where we will discuss negotiation of your contract in more detail. This podcast is not recorded as an official podcast of any institution or organization. The podcast is unfunded. Opinions are those of the individual participants. Music by Audrey Nath. Artwork by Shivani Ghoshal. Want more content like this? Be sure to subscribe to the Neurology Nuts and Bolts podcast on all available platforms. To hear more about constructing your career in neurology, follow us on Twitter @NeuroBolts and on Facebook to stay up to date on new content and give us feedback on what you want to hear, and tell your friends. Thanks for joining us.